as basic as it is, but you put ear pods in, you're basically pushing out distractions. So anything like that is, I think, the way that platforms in the future can drive more attention to their experiences.
The true puppet master of our attention is actually the platform that we're using.
So I think interactivity from a user experience perspective and AR and things like that is kind of, and it's amazing, by the way. So when you're immersed like that, it is truly an attention amplifier.
Welcome to Rules Don't Apply, where we're speaking with pioneers, provocateurs, and purveyors of non-conventional wisdom. Recorded alongside a live audience at South by Southwest Sydney, this series seeks to redefine the art of the possible. Because for those looking to navigate what's next, the rules of today may just no longer apply. Let's kick things off. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. If you are wandering into the gallery, pop on over. We have a very, very special guest and we're going to have a bit of fun and interesting conversation. Rules no longer apply. But I'm joined by the fabulous Dr. Karen Nelson-Field. For those playing at home, Dr. Nelson-Field is a globally renowned media science researcher who has helped fundamentally transform the way that we measure media on a global scale. She's the chief executive of Amplified Intelligence, who have been pioneering the thinking on omnichannel measurement for almost a decade. She is a prominent advisor to major media agencies and global brands in this capacity. Her work is frequently featured in publications such as Bloomberg, CNBC, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. She is a multiple best-selling author of Viral Marketing and the Attention Economy, How Media Works, and you are just about to release your third book, The Attention Economy, A Category Blueprint. It's quite a Rolodex. Karen, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, everybody. Give her a round of applause.
I'm embarrassed.
And you're an interesting guest to have on this because, the thematic is rules don't apply, but you're fundamentally in the business of writing rules and then re-breaking them and writing rules again.
It's interesting you say that because my whole agenda since leaving the university was to kind of, to your point, deconstruct the rules and re-put them together. So I think you're correct in that way. But there has to be rules with measurement, right? Because it's supposed to be universal and systematic. So there needs to be rules, which we can see in our data. But to your point, you have to break them down. It's first principles thinking, I guess.
Yep. What are the forces really shaping where and who we point our attention to right now?
The reality is, and most people don't really realise this, so just to be clear, we've collected biometric data through cameras across something like 17 countries, 2 million samples. So it's not small data, and ultimately I think it's nearly 3 billion data points. And when you've got that kind of scale data, you can see the systematic patterns that sit underneath it. And the thing that drives our attention is not what you think. You're less in control of your own attention. The user experience of the platform or the format is what actually forces you to pay attention or not. So if you think about the engineers in Menlo Park that are there, sitting there, working out down to the tiniest little degree how you're interacting with that interface, it's the same for advertising. So when you crack that code, that's what's driving your attention. So how you interact with Snapchat, for example, even though I'm older, would be the same by the nature of the user experience. So, that's good for measurement because it means it can be predictable. Society, maybe not so. But I call it, there's a book called Hooked and Stolen Focus, all those types of books talk about it.
It's a great book.
If you think about those principles, it works the same with advertising.
The true puppet master of our attention is actually the platform that we're using.
100%.
And so then what happens when a new player in the game gets introduced? TikTok, for example, that, arrives a couple of years.
Nothing changes. It's their user experience that teaches you as well.
And so our habits just shift, much like chameleons, we then start to habituate towards the way that particular platform.
So that's actually an interesting point. So you would have heard, and it's even in the press again, the concept of not all reach is equal, which I found years and years and years ago when I was still an academic. That's why not all reach is equal, because how you interact with platform A is very different to how you interact with platform B. But the measurement system, which is time in view, is equal. So the reality is there's a gap between how you interact with Facebook, but the time in view clicker is saying you're on that platform for 10 seconds compared to, say, TikTok. Time in view clicker is saying you're on for 10 seconds, but the way you interact with it's very different. So if a new player comes in, I mean, there's a fragmentation issue in terms of reach, I get all of that. But in terms of your attention, you're trained to pay attention the way the engineers want you to.
And does all of this change in a world where, you and I were talking about this just before, if I can go and book an entire family trip via voice calling through a pair of, headphones, or if a ChatGPT algorithm can get me to the solution that I need to without having to interact directly with a platform per se. What changes in terms of how we measure it and what we can measure?
Not a lot. I mean, at the end of the day, and I mentioned this, the best thing that's happened to me in our business is that ChatGPT is mainstream. So we're a proper machine learning business, which most people didn't really understand the need for training data for prediction. So what I love about chat and, all of the other kind of
Insert LLM
type,
here,
whatever, is that humans are, we are starting to understand that they've needed a shit ton, should I say shit ton?
You can say whatever you want.
Of training data for it to work,
Yep.
right? Because otherwise, if you've ever used ChatGPT version 1, it was a bit hit and miss in its ability to predict the next word, but the more training data that it gets, like now we're up to 5 or 6 version, the better the prediction. So if you think about humans are one of the most complex to predict, so ChatGPT has been great for us because we take this approach. So we've collected so much human data around attention. So we essentially we have AI models that predict your next move within an inch of your life. So in that sense, it's been good for us because it basically describes the type of method that we've been using for years.
So as more and more of us start to use these, immense LLMs, do we all just kind of move to the messy middle and start to,
It's interesting. Look, measurement's different. I mean, measurement is how are you interacting with a format and what does that mean for the ecosystem, right? But what I have seen, and it is in my current book, and there's a big issue around brands that are starting to untrain their future buyers. And it's a big warning to brand owners because your brand, isn't getting a lot of attention because the reality of what a view looks like is a lot lower than you think. But B, with the advent of LLMs, I did this little experiment, and it's published in this book, that if I'd like to say Google in chat, but I don't think that's what it is. If you typed in an ad with a running shoe, sometimes it'll have a Nike symbol and sometimes it won't. But if you kind of think about all the different categories, there were multiple big brands that it didn't pick up, whereas Coke picked it up all the time. So my point is, there is a real need, I think, from a brand perspective, to think about how your branding components are actually part of the training data for future LLMs. Because I think the more they're used, the more you want your brand to be present in that training
in those
data.
outcomes, yeah. In an age where those LLMs are trained off user data, how would one insert their brand into that training set?
Well, just use it more.
And so do great products and services win? If I step forward 10 years, one of the things that I love about the advent of these, LLM ecosystems is it puts the power, in my mind, it shifts back to the consumer. And if your product or service is exceptional, then more consumers will use it. And then it's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy where all of a sudden it's in the training data more prevalently, so it gets floated to consumers more prevalently, and sort of this virtuous value creation loop.
So one of the things we see in the hundreds of thousands of ads we collect is that brands, and I was talking about this before, at Cannes there's this whole thing around blanding and dull,
boring,
creative and all that sort of stuff. But one of the things that brand marketers do is they're fearful for overt branding. And I mean, way back when I was still an academic in 2013, I did a piece of work that showed that doesn't deter you, overt branding doesn't deter you from sharing content when it was the whole viral scene. But even to this day, most marketers are nervous to put their brand in second one, but the reality is by second two, about 20% of the market that you think have already scrolled away. So there's a real need for brands to start using quality branding within their creative, because I often say, here's the reality. Attention and outcomes are related, but not linearly. And the reason why they're not linearly related, so any vendor that tells you they are is lying to you, because I could find you 5 seconds of time.
I'm absolutely in agreement with you.
But I could find you 5 seconds of time, but if you've got a creative that is poorly branded, it will be misattributed to either your bigger competitor or someone else in a different category. And the reality of that is that's completely to do with the branding components of it, because it doesn't get seen. So even today I'm talking about the double jeopardy of low attention formats and how that impacts particularly challenger brands. So if I have any advice from a creative side is be more overt in an age where inattention is real. And we have these, ML systems that are kind of going to be the future of so much of our creative generation. Then you need to start to think about ensuring that your brand is front and center. So it's about entry timing, size, consistency, frequency. But again, most brand marketers think they shouldn't be like that, but that's the reality.
I just want to go back a second. You mentioned untrain your customers. What did you mean by that?
So I presented this at Cannes last year. I feel like it's last year, but it was this year, a few months ago even. And I called the presentation Finger Licking What? So basically, what we see is that the less quality branding you have, the easier it is for a viewer to misattribute it to a competitor. So what we're seeing is that even really big, massive brands with legacy distinctive assets are being clever in TikTok, in Snap, because they think it's what the youth want. But the reality is now the youth are starting to forget you. So we talk about unlearning in the measurement side as being of real importance to consider. So that's a whole separate part of my agenda, which is you need to unlearn the reliance on viewability, and how reach works, etc. But you've got to relearn the basics of branding and marketing, because the reality of inattention is so significant that you've got to step back to basics.
Do you think differentiation and distinction, more of the fuel mix to be distinct, sits beyond the product and into experience now? Because we've got just so much choice, 700 different types of shampoo.
Well, look, that's Jenny Romaniuk's area, not mine, but she's an amazing academic and found 1 trillion times that distinctiveness wins over differentiation any day. And the reality is, you ask anyone what's their most famous ad, they'll think of an ad that they probably watched on TV in the heyday, and not necessarily think about as many in the digital space, and that's largely because we see the brand really consistently. So distinctiveness is a part of that.
What do you think is the antidote to the attention recession over the next 10 years?
There isn't.
Oh, all right. So what can you do as a brand then to swim against the tide?
You've got to accept what the reality is.
Okay.
So there's two things that I work on. There's the inattention issue, or the attention economy, is essentially looking at what is obvious and then the less obvious. So there's two sort of streams that we focus on. One is, the obvious is if your ad is not seen, you can't get a sale. That's the obvious. So to your point, what can brands do, or what can marketers do? But then the less obvious, and this is just blown up overnight, is the significant flow-on effects that has to an ecosystem that is measuring reach poorly. So that's a whole nother level.
Yeah.
So you said to me, what can marketers do? The reality is you have to understand this, and then two things. You have to think about how you may amplify attention within the boundaries that you can, because most people think if you put creative on a format that your creative is amazing and it might be an award winner, that you can buck the trend, but the reality is you can't. And we've proven that a trillion times. So I think the answer to that is you just need to understand it. It is the new normal. That's okay.
Yeah.
Make sure that you understand it.
And we're all, in the same paddock roaming.
Yep.
If there was one truism, that brands and advertisers were all subscribing to, that we need to jettison, we need to have that conventional wisdom unshackled from our thinking, what would it be?
I think some marketers think that the concept of not all reach is equal is cliche, or is they don't really understand that. The truism of not all reach is equal is real, and it's related to how we measure impressions, particularly in the digital ecosystem. So I don't know about truism. I mean, maybe feed me what sort of...
What are we all worshipping at the false altar of? Is it reach? Is it sort of, reach in its sort of most amalgamous?
So it's interesting. I when I started this years and years ago, I thought that maybe attention could be a currency unto itself, but it's not. Where I see reach will always be the currency, full stop. And the reason why it is because it's in every single workflow, ecosystem, model, MMM, you name it, right? So we can't change that in any kind of quick way. What you do need to do is you need to wait for its, as in WEIGHT, you have to wait for the performance of reach to attention, and then all reach will be equal again. So the truism for me is, no, reach is important, and as much as I've had my moments with less favourable comments from Byron Sharp, the reality is that is, you have to reach more people to grow your brand. So reach is important. My argument is the way that the measurement ecosystem works is that reach is not equal, and you have to understand how to work.
Yeah, not all eyeballs are equal.
All eyeballs are equal, but it's how you interact with the format that means there's more wastage or not relative to a reach point. That's heavy for just flying in at
look,
9
it's
o'clock
early
in the morning.
Let's change pace a little bit, because I'd like to understand how you go about changing the minds of the industries that you work with, right? There's been some tectonic shifts, many that you've been really at the pioneering end of. When you're swimming against the tide and you're telling an industry, right, that often the cornerstones in which it's built its thinking are wrong, how do you go about changing that mind? Because there's going to be a lot of people listening to you going, this is exactly the problem that I've got. How do I go about it?
It's interesting you say that. So obviously, I was an academic for a while. I'm not swimming against the tide. I picked the perfect storm. I knew it was coming.
Okay.
Years and years and years ago. So there are three kind of really critical things that are happening in market at the moment. There's been a rally cry for data quality for a long time. There's been an issue around privacy, which is still on-off, Google cookie on-off. And then there's also the advancement of technology. So to be quite frank with you, I haven't been pushing against the tide. I knew that there would be a currency crisis, and it is happening. So what I've just done is reminded people how it sort of fits together, and to your point then, broken it all down and gone, how can we move forward? Yep. So the study of attention economics is basically to understand the cause of inattention, the consequences of it, and the course correct. And that's the same in any ecosystem. So what's the cause of distracted driving? What's the consequences of distracted driving? What are the course correct of that? It's the same in our ecosystem. So to be honest, my goal in the early days was to take a leaf out of Jonah Goodhart's book, who was the founder of Moat. And what he did was, when he kind of moved into the viewability space, he kind of appealed to agencies who would gain the most from change to something more effective. And so basically that's what we did. We started in the agency space. They're the ones that can get you on stage in Cannes. They're the ones that can get you on stage at CES. And they've been a great early adopter But now it's moved beyond that, and brands are jumping in a lot sort of greater way. So to be quite frank, I'm not pushing against the tide. All I did was try to work through how I would simply explain a complex problem and solution.
What's the most unconventional approach that you've had to bring and challenge conventional wisdom with?
That most people think that, like I said, that their attention is their own and that they're in control of it. And most people think that it's random. So
What do you mean by that?
In that, if we were going to build an ecosystem, a measurement ecosystem out of attention, how the hell could we do that? Because with all of the people in the world, we pretty much all pay different attention. So how could you build a system around that? So the challenging of that is there are ridiculously perfect, what I call attention laws. So there are systematic patterns that sit under this data, which again, I've worked out is because of the user experience. So I think that sort of surprised me, and it challenges conventional wisdom, because most of us think that, how
we're in control.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think the next quantum leap in either capturing attention or user experience is going to look like?
So I think interactivity from a user experience perspective and AR and things like that is kind of, and it's amazing, by the way. So when you're immersed like that, it is truly an attention amplifier. I mean, think Snap. We did an SDK for Snap and
with their glasses?
No, through their app. So, things like that. I mean, even things like we've worked with Spotify Global, and as basic as it is, but you put ear pods in, you're basically pushing out distractions. So anything like that is, I think, the way that platforms in the future can drive more attention to their experiences.
All right, last one from me. If there were 3 pieces of advice that you could give to brands and marketers to optimize their focus in the world of attention and measuring attention, what would that be?
3 pieces of advice for me are, there are things you can do to slightly amplify the attention opportunity.
Okay.
And they are, things like emotions and unexpectedness. So there are some creative triggers that you can, but you can't sort of move outside the boundaries that the platform affords you. The second piece is outcomes are very different from attention. So there are things you can do to amplify outcomes, which is a lot to do with how your creative connects your brand to the sale, which is very different from attention.
Yep.
And the third piece of advice would be, this is real, and the change in our measurement ecosystem is the largest since 20 years ago when viewability was introduced. So get on board, understand it, and think about how it can impact your workflows.
Awesome. I think that's wonderful advice. And I think understanding the nuance between attention and outcome, I think, is easy to say, but really challenging to do, particularly as a marketer.
Well, only because we come from a performance marketing world where, if it's all optimized down to its like almost out of the park, and it just, I mean, if you've read anything that, Peter Field has done or Les Binet, I think we are kind of moving back to
a bit more calibrated scale.
Yeah, a bit more calibrated, that's the way to put it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Nelson-Field, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for
It's been
having me.
wonderful chatting to you.
Take care, everyone.